3 years ago, FBI Special Agent William Hayes, 40, disappeared after what appeared to be a routine bank robbery response in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, leaving behind no traces and a family shattered by unanswered questions. The disappearance plunged his wife Sarah and their 2 teenage children into a nightmare of uncertainty, while the law enforcement community, his own brotherhood, was left stunned by the vanishing of one of their most dedicated agents. The FBI launched an immediate investigation, considering possibilities ranging from kidnapping by criminals seeking revenge to voluntary disappearance. But despite their vast resources and expertise, they couldn't solve the case of their own missing agent, causing outrage and disbelief among the Hayes family, who refused to accept that William would simply vanish. Fighting tirelessly for answers, they've spent 3 years demanding the truth about what really happened that October morning, when their world collapsed. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen cold cases with respect and evidence. The morning of October 15, 2021, began like any other Tuesday for William Hayes. A 15-year veteran of the FBI's Phoenix field office, William was known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering dedication to justice. His colleagues describe him as the kind of agent who never left loose ends, never compromised on procedure, and never, ever abandoned his post without explanation. At 6:30 a.m., he kissed his wife Sarah goodbye, ruffled his son Michael's hair as the 16-year-old grabbed breakfast before school, and promised his 14-year-old daughter Emma he'd be home in time for her soccer practice. It was a promise he would never keep. The call came in at 9:47 a.m. First National Bank on Central Avenue was being robbed. Multiple units responded, but William's unmarked sedan was the first to arrive on scene. Witnesses later told investigators they saw him park across the street, speak briefly into his radio, and walk purposefully toward the bank's entrance. Security footage from a nearby coffee shop captured him checking his weapon and adjusting his bulletproof vest, standard procedure for any armed response. But then something changed. In the final frames before he disappears from view, William appears to hesitate, looking over his shoulder as if he'd heard something or someone calling his name. What happened next would launch one of the most baffling investigations in FBI history. When backup units arrived 3 minutes later, they found chaos. Bank employees huddled behind counters, customers lying face down on marble floors, and 2 suspects fleeing through a rear exit. But William Hayes was nowhere to be found. His radio was discovered on the sidewalk outside, its battery mysteriously dead. His service weapon remained holstered. Most disturbing of all, no one, not employees, not customers, not even the bank's extensive surveillance system, had any record of the FBI agent entering the building. The official timeline made no sense. The bank's security cameras, which should have captured everything, suffered what technicians called a temporary malfunction, lasting exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the precise window when William should have entered the bank. The robbery itself seemed almost secondary, with the perpetrators taking less than $3,000 before fleeing, leaving behind a scene that felt more like a stage set than a real crime. As hours turned to days, search teams combed every inch of downtown Phoenix. They found nothing. William Hayes had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. In the days following William's disappearance, the FBI's investigation began to uncover inconsistencies that transformed what seemed like a straightforward case into something far more sinister. The bank robbery that had initially been treated as the primary crime started to feel like an elaborate distraction, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to mask something much darker. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that William had been working on a classified case that his superiors now claimed didn't exist, accessing files that, according to official records, were never created, and meeting with informants whose identities had been mysteriously scrubbed from all databases. Sarah Hayes spent sleepless nights in her husband's home office, searching through his personal belongings for any clue that might explain his disappearance. What she found chilled her to the bone. Hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer was a USB drive containing encrypted files that William had apparently been compiling for months. The files contained surveillance photos of government officials, transcripts of recorded conversations, and most disturbing of all, evidence of what appeared to be a systematic cover-up involving high-ranking members of federal agencies. When Sarah attempted to turn this evidence over to the FBI, She was told that the files were either corrupted or contained information that was above her security clearance. The official investigation, led by William's own colleagues, began to show signs of being compromised from within. Key witnesses started changing their stories. Security footage from surrounding buildings was confiscated and never returned. The two bank robbers, who should have been the FBI's primary leads, were somehow never identified despite clear images from multiple cameras. When Sarah demanded answers, she was told that the investigation was ongoing and that she needed to trust the process. But trust was becoming impossible when the very people investigating her husband's disappearance seemed more interested in burying the case than solving it. Detective Maria Santos from Phoenix PD, who had been assigned as liaison to the federal investigation, began to notice the same inconsistencies that were troubling Sarah. A 20-year veteran of law enforcement, Santos had worked dozens of missing persons cases, but nothing like this. In her experience, investigations moved forward. Evidence was collected, witnesses were interviewed, leads were pursued. But the Hayes case seemed to be moving backward, with evidence disappearing and witnesses becoming unavailable. When she tried to access the bank's backup security system, she was told it had suffered a catastrophic failure on the same day as the robbery. 3 months after William's disappearance, Santos made a decision that would change everything. Working unofficially and off the books, she began conducting her own investigation. What she discovered would make her question everything she thought she knew about law enforcement. The bank that had been robbed had connections to several offshore accounts linked to a private military contractor that had been under federal investigation. William Hayes had been the lead agent on that investigation. The morning he disappeared, he had been scheduled to meet with a whistleblower who claimed to have evidence of the contractor's illegal activities. That whistleblower was found dead in his hotel room the same evening, an apparent suicide that left no note and raised more questions than answers. As winter turned to spring, the Hayes family's hope began to fade, but their determination only grew stronger. Sarah hired a private investigator, mortgaged their home to pay for it, and began reaching out to journalists who specialized in government cover-ups. Michael and Emma, forced to grow up faster than any children should, became their mother's researchers, spending evenings helping her organize evidence and document the FBI's failures. They were a family united by loss, but strengthened by their refusal to accept the official silence that had surrounded their father's disappearance. By the first anniversary of William's disappearance, the Hayes family had become pariahs within the law enforcement community that had once welcomed them with open arms. Sarah's questions were met with bureaucratic stonewalling. Her phone calls went unreturned. When she attended memorial services for fallen officers, conversations stopped when she entered the room. The message was clear. Some cases were meant to remain cold, and those who refused to accept that reality would find themselves isolated and alone. But Sarah wasn't alone. Detective Santos had been quietly building her own network of concerned officers who believed that the Hayes case represented something much larger than one missing agent. They called themselves the Watchers, a group of law enforcement professionals who met in secret to share information about cases that seemed to have been deliberately sabotaged from within. Through this network, Santos learned that William Hayes wasn't the first federal agent to disappear under suspicious circumstances. Over the past 5 years, at least 7 FBI agents working on classified cases involving government contractors had either disappeared, died in apparent accidents, or been quietly transferred to remote locations where their work would have no impact. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Each of these agents had been investigating connections between private military contractors, offshore banking, and high-ranking government officials. Each had been getting close to breakthrough discoveries when their cases were either reassigned or they themselves became victims of unfortunate circumstances. William Hayes had been the most recent, but he wouldn't be the last. Santos realized they were dealing with something that went far beyond a single missing person case. They were looking at systematic elimination of threats to a network that reached into the highest levels of American government. Meanwhile, Michael Hayes was struggling with anger that threatened to consume him. His junior year of high school was marked by fights, failing grades, and increasingly dangerous behavior. His guidance counselor suggested therapy, but how could he explain that his rage wasn't just teenage rebellion? It was the fury of a son who knew his father had been betrayed by the very system he had sworn to serve. Emma, always the more introspective of the two siblings, channeled her pain differently. She became obsessed with conspiracy theories and government cover-ups, spending hours on dark web forums where users shared stories of federal agents who had asked too many questions. The second anniversary passed with a small memorial service that felt more like a funeral than a celebration of hope. Sarah placed flowers at a tree in their backyard, where William had built a treehouse for the children years earlier. As she stood there remembering the man who had made their house a home, she made a decision that would change everything. She was done waiting for answers. She was done trusting a system that had failed her family. If the truth about William's disappearance was buried, she would dig it up herself no matter what it cost. Detective Santos attended the memorial service, standing at the back of the small gathering like a guardian angel in a badge. After the other guests had left, she approached Sarah with something that made both women's hearts race with equal parts hope and terror. "I've been working this case for 2 years," Santos said quietly, "and I think I know why your husband disappeared. But what I'm about to tell you will put both our lives in danger. Are you sure you want to know the truth?" Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 731 days. Yes, I want to know the truth, no matter what it costs." As autumn settled over Phoenix, bringing with it the kind of desert wind that seems to whisper secrets in the darkness, neither woman could have imagined that the truth they were seeking would arrive in the most unexpected way possible, delivered not by an investigation or a breakthrough, but by a mysterious letter that would shatter everything they thought they knew about William Hayes and the reason he had vanished without a trace. Detective Santos had been carrying the weight of her discovery for 6 months, and the burden was slowly destroying her. What she had uncovered about William Hayes's real investigation wasn't just career-ending, it was life-threatening. In the privacy of her car, parked in a remote corner of South Mountain Park where surveillance would be difficult, she finally shared with Sarah the truth that had been eating away at her conscience. William hadn't been investigating a simple government contractor fraud case. He had stumbled upon something called Operation Silent Thunder, a classified program that used private military contractors to eliminate federal agents who got too close to exposing corruption within the highest levels of government. The evidence Santos had gathered painted a terrifying picture of systematic assassination disguised as accidents, disappearances, and suicides. William had been tracking offshore accounts that funneled money from defense contracts into personal bank accounts belonging to senators, congressmen, and even Supreme Court justices. The private military contractor he was investigating, Blackwater Dynamics, wasn't just stealing government money. They were acting as enforcers for a shadow network that had been operating for over a decade. When federal agents like William got too close to the truth, Blackwater's operatives would stage elaborate scenarios to make them disappear without raising suspicions. Sarah listened to Santos's revelations with a mixture of horror and vindication. Everything she had suspected about her husband's disappearance was true, but the reality was far worse than she had imagined. William hadn't just been kidnapped. He had been specifically targeted for elimination because his investigation threatened to expose a conspiracy that reached into every branch of government. The bank robbery had been nothing more than theater, a distraction that allowed Blackwater operatives to abduct William, while making it appear that he had simply vanished during a chaotic crime scene. But Santos had more than theories. Hidden in her personal safe were copies of encrypted communications between Blackwater executives and their government contacts, financial records showing payments to eliminate problematic assets, and most damning of all, a recorded phone conversation where William's own supervisor discussed neutralizing the Hayes problem. The FBI hadn't failed to solve William's disappearance. They had actively participated in covering it up. Every dead end in the investigation had been deliberately created. Every missing piece of evidence had been intentionally destroyed. As Santos revealed each piece of evidence, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her faith in the system crumble. The country her husband had sworn to protect had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. The colleagues who had attended his memorial service knew exactly what had happened to him. The superiors who had promised her answers were the same people who had ordered his elimination. For 3 years, she had been fighting a system that was never going to give her justice because that system was responsible for her husband's fate. The conversation in the desert lasted for 3 hours as Santos walked Sarah through every document, every recording, Every piece of evidence that proved William's disappearance was an assassination. By the time they finished, both women understood that they were no longer just seeking answers. They were preparing for war, a war against an enemy that controlled the very institutions that were supposed to protect American citizens, a war that would require them to abandon everything they had believed about law, order, and justice. As they sat in the growing darkness, watching the lights of Phoenix twinkle below them like distant stars, Santos made Sarah a promise that would change both their lives forever. "Your husband died trying to expose the truth," she said. "We're going to finish what he started, even if it kills us." Sarah's response was immediate and unwavering. "William always said that some fights are worth dying for. I guess we're about to find out if he was right." 3 years to the day after William Hayes disappeared, Sarah found an unmarked envelope slipped under her front door. There was no postmark, no return address, nothing to indicate who had delivered it or when. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that would shatter her understanding of her husband's fate and launch the most dangerous phase of her quest for truth. The letter was brief, but devastating. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband is alive. The government wants you to believe he's dead. Meet me at the Heard Museum tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Trust no one in law enforcement. A friend who remembers the truth." The timing wasn't coincidental. 3 years was significant in the world of classified operations. It was the standard waiting period before terminated assets were officially declared dead and their cases permanently sealed. Someone had waited exactly this long to contact Sarah, which meant they understood the system well enough to know when it would be safest to break their silence. As Sarah read and reread the letter, her hands shaking with a mixture of hope and terror, she realized that everything she thought she knew about her husband's disappearance was about to change again. Detective Santos, when Sarah called her in panic and excitement, immediately recognized the sophistication of the contact method. The Heard Museum was a public place with multiple exits, security cameras that would discourage violence but weren't monitored by federal agencies, and enough crowd cover to allow for a discreet meeting. Whoever had written the letter understood operational security, which meant they were either someone with intelligence training or someone who had been taught by professionals. The instruction to trust no one in law enforcement was particularly telling. It suggested that the author knew about the conspiracy, but wasn't part of it. The night before the meeting, Sarah couldn't sleep. For 3 years, she had been living with the assumption that William was dead, murdered by the same government he had served faithfully for 15 years. The possibility that he might be alive was almost too overwhelming to process. Where had he been? Why hadn't he contacted her? Was he being held prisoner or was he hiding? The questions multiplied in her mind like cancer cells, each one spawning dozens of others until she felt like her sanity was hanging by a thread. Michael and Emma sensed their mother's agitation, though she had decided not to tell them about the letter until after the meeting. Both teenagers had grown up fast during the 3 years since their father's disappearance, but she couldn't bear the thought of raising their hopes only to have them crushed again. Michael, now 19 and a sophomore at Arizona State University, had channeled his anger into studying criminal justice, determined to become the kind of FBI agent his father had been. Emma, 17 and preparing for her senior year of high school, had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions and motivations, a survival skill born from watching her family navigate a world of lies and deception. The next afternoon, as Sarah walked through the Heard Museum's galleries of Native American art, she felt like she was moving through a dream. Ancient pottery and traditional jewelry seemed to watch her pass, silent witnesses to a meeting that would determine the course of her family's future. At exactly 3 p.m., a woman approached her near the contemporary art exhibit, a woman Sarah had never seen before, but who somehow knew exactly who she was. The woman was in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that held the kind of weariness that comes from carrying dangerous secrets for too long. "Mrs. Hayes," the woman said quietly, "my name is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. I was your husband's handler for a classified operation that officially never existed. What I'm about to tell you will endanger both our lives, but William made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to contact you after exactly 3 years. That time has come, and I'm here to honor my promise to a man who died serving his country in ways that will never be acknowledged. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps William Hayes' story reach more people." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison had spent 30 years working in the shadows of American intelligence, running operations that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. Her official title was Senior Analyst for the Department of Homeland Security, but her real job was managing assets who had been burned by their own agencies, agents like William Hayes, who had discovered truths that made them liabilities to the very government they served. What she revealed to Sarah in the quiet corner of the museum would redefine everything the Hayes family thought they knew about William's disappearance and his current status. William wasn't dead. He was part of what Morrison called the Underground Railroad, a secret network of federal agents who had been marked for elimination, but had been extracted and hidden before their assassinations could be carried out. The network operated completely outside official channels, funded through redirected black ops budgets, and staffed by intelligence professionals who refused to participate in the systematic murder of American law enforcement officers. Morrison had been running this operation for 12 years, saving the lives of 43 agents who had gotten too close to government corruption. The bank robbery that had supposedly led to William's disappearance had indeed been a setup, but not in the way Sarah had imagined. Morrison's team had learned about the planned assassination 3 days before it was scheduled to occur. They had infiltrated the operation, replaced Blackwater's kill team with their own operatives, and extracted William during the chaos of the staged robbery. The malfunction in the bank's security system had been deliberately engineered to provide cover for the extraction. William's radio had been left behind to suggest he had been killed or kidnapped, while he was actually being transported to a safe house in the mountains of Colorado. For 3 years, William had been living under a new identity, working with Morrison's team to gather evidence against the shadow network that had tried to kill him. He knew about Sarah's investigation, knew about Detective Santos's involvement, knew about his children's struggles to cope with his absence, but contact had been impossible because any communication would have put the entire family at risk. The people who wanted William dead were monitoring every aspect of the Hayes family's life, waiting for any sign that he had survived the assassination attempt. Morrison explained that the timing of this contact wasn't arbitrary. After 3 years of careful investigation, William and her team had finally gathered enough evidence to destroy the conspiracy that had targeted him. They had financial records, recorded communications, and testimony from other extracted agents that would expose the entire network. But they needed Sarah's help to deliver this evidence to the only journalist they trusted, someone who had been investigating similar cases for years and had the resources to protect the story until it could be published. The plan Morrison outlined was dangerous and complex. Sarah would need to travel to Washington, D.C., under the pretense of visiting her sister, who had been providing alibis for Sarah's activities for 3 years. While there, she would meet with investigative journalist Marcus Rodriguez, who had been working on a story about murdered federal agents for the past 18 months. Rodriguez had already published preliminary articles suggesting that something systemic was targeting FBI agents, but he lacked the definitive proof that Morrison's team had gathered. As Morrison prepared to leave, she handed Sarah a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone, but was actually an encrypted communication system. "Your husband will contact you through this device once you've successfully delivered the evidence to Rodriguez," she explained. "He wants you to know that every day he's been gone has been torture, but he couldn't risk putting you and the children in danger by revealing that he was alive. The people we're fighting don't hesitate to murder entire families to protect their secrets." Standing in the museum, surrounded by artifacts of cultures that had survived centuries of oppression and betrayal, Sarah felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Accepting Morrison's mission would put her in immediate danger, but it would also reunite her with the husband she had mourned for 3 years. More importantly, it would give her the chance to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed countless families like hers. As she looked at Morrison's weathered face, Sarah saw the reflection of her own determination to fight against a system that had betrayed everything she had once believed in. "What do I tell my children?" Sarah asked, and Morrison's answer revealed the true cost of their war against the shadows. "You tell them that their father is coming home, but first we have to make sure there's still a country worth coming home to." Sarah's flight to Washington, D.C. felt like a journey into the heart of enemy territory. As the plane descended through gray October clouds toward Reagan National Airport, she clutched the encrypted device Dr. Morrison had given her, knowing that it contained not just her connection to William, but evidence that could topple a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of American government. The cover story was simple. She was visiting her sister Jennifer for a long overdue family reunion, but Sarah knew that every movement she made would be monitored by the same people who had tried to kill her husband 3 years earlier. Jennifer Hayes Martinez had been Sarah's anchor throughout the nightmare of William's disappearance, providing emotional support and, when necessary, alibis for Sarah's investigation activities. A federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, Jennifer understood the dangerous game her sister was playing and had used her own connections to verify some of the information Detective Santos had uncovered. When Sarah called to arrange the family visit, Jennifer immediately understood that this wasn't a social call. The code phrase, "I need to see the cherry blossoms," meant that Sarah was coming to DC on a mission that could get them both killed. The meeting with Marcus Rodriguez was scheduled for the 3rd day of Sarah's visit, in the reading room of the Library of Congress, a location chosen for its multiple security cameras that would discourage violence while providing enough public access to allow for a discreet exchange. Rodriguez was a legend in investigative journalism, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who had spent the last 2 decades exposing government corruption with a fearlessness that had made him both famous and perpetually threatened. His series on murdered federal agents had already rattled cages in Washington, but he lacked the definitive proof needed to name names and reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. As Sarah walked through the marble halls of the Jefferson Building, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This was where democracy's secrets were supposed to be preserved and protected, but she was here to expose how that same democracy had been corrupted from within. At precisely 2 p.m., she found Rodriguez in the main reading room, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He recognized her immediately. He had been studying her case for months, understanding that the Hayes family represented the human cost of the conspiracy he was investigating. The exchange took less than 5 minutes, but required 3 years of careful preparation. Sarah handed Rodriguez a thumb drive containing terabytes of evidence that Morrison's team had gathered, financial records showing payments to assassinate federal agents, recorded conversations between government officials and Blackwater Dynamics executives, and most damning of all, a complete list of the 43 agents who had been targeted for elimination over the past 12 years. Rodriguez's hands actually trembled as he understood the magnitude of what he was holding, evidence that would rewrite the history of American law enforcement and potentially bring down a dozen high-ranking government officials. "Mrs. Hayes," Rodriguez said quietly, "what you've given me will change everything, but you need to understand that once I publish this story, there will be no going back. The people responsible for your husband's disappearance will do anything to discredit this evidence and eliminate anyone connected to it. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and danger?" Sarah's response came without hesitation. "Mr. Rodriguez, they've already taken 3 years of my life and put my family through hell. If exposing the truth puts us in more danger, at least we'll be fighting back instead of just surviving." That evening, as Sarah sat in Jennifer's Georgetown apartment, the encrypted device finally came to life. A single message appeared on the screen. "Package delivered successfully. Homecoming in 72 hours. Tell the children their father loves them and is proud of who they've become. The long nightmare is almost over." W. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that her family might actually be whole again. But she also understood that the next 72 hours would be the most dangerous of their lives, as powerful people realized that their decades-old conspiracy was about to be exposed to the world. Marcus Rodriguez worked for 36 hours straight, verifying every document, cross-referencing every financial record, and confirming the authenticity of every recorded conversation that Sarah had delivered. What he discovered went beyond his worst suspicions about government corruption. The conspiracy that had targeted William Hayes wasn't just about eliminating troublesome FBI agents. It was a systematic program to control federal law enforcement by removing anyone who couldn't be bought, blackmailed, or intimidated into silence. The evidence showed that over 12 years, 43 agents had been murdered, disappeared, or forced into hiding because they had discovered connections between government officials and private military contractors. The story Rodriguez published on Sunday morning would become the most read investigative piece in the history of American journalism. The Underground Railroad, How the U.S. Government Hunts Its Own Agents, revealed the existence of Operation Silent Thunder, named Blackwater Dynamics executives, and included recorded conversations where senators and congressmen discussed neutralizing problematic assets in the FBI. Most shocking of all, the article included testimony from 12 of the supposedly dead agents who were actually living under assumed identities, protected by Dr. Morrison's secret network. Within hours of publication, Rodriguez's website crashed from the volume of traffic. Major networks were scrambling to confirm the story, and social media was exploding with demands for congressional investigations. The evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss as conspiracy theory, too well documented to ignore, and too damaging to contain through the usual methods of government damage control. By Monday morning, 3 senators had resigned. The director of Blackwater Dynamics was in federal custody, and FBI agents across the country were refusing to take orders from superiors who might be implicated in the conspiracy. But the most important result of Rodriguez's article was a single paragraph buried in the middle of the story. FBI Special Agent William Hayes, believed to have been killed during a bank robbery in Phoenix 3 years ago, is actually alive and has been working undercover to gather evidence against the conspiracy that targeted him. Hayes is expected to emerge from hiding within the next 48 hours to testify before a special congressional committee about his experiences and the evidence he has gathered. Sarah read that paragraph while sitting in Jennifer's kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over the Potomac River. After 3 years of uncertainty, grief, and desperate investigation, the truth was finally public. William was alive, the conspiracy was exposed, and their long nightmare was ending. But she also understood that the next phase would bring its own challenges. How do you rebuild a family after 3 years of assumed death? How do you explain to children that their father had been alive but unable to contact them? How do you trust a government that tried to murder your husband? The encrypted device buzzed with another message. Coming home today. Flight arrives Phoenix Sky Harbor at 6 p.m. Gate B12. Be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. I love you more than words can express. W. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, memorizing every word. In 12 hours, she would see her husband for the first time since that October morning when he had kissed her goodbye and promised to be home for Emma's soccer practice. The man who returned would be the same William she had married, but he would also be forever changed by 3 years of living in the shadows, fighting a war that most Americans never knew existed. As Sarah prepared to return to Phoenix, she realized that the hardest part of their ordeal might still be ahead of them. Exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. Now they would have to learn how to be a family again, how to trust in a future when their past had been built on lies and secrets. But for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Not just hope for justice or answers, but hope for ordinary things like family dinners, weekend mornings in bed, and the simple pleasure of falling asleep next to the man she loved. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport had never looked more beautiful to Sarah than it did on that October evening as she waited at Gate B12 with Michael and Emma beside her. She had finally told the children the truth the night before, watching their faces transform from disbelief to anger to overwhelming joy as they processed the news that their father was alive and coming home. Michael, now a young man of 19, struggled with the revelation that he had spent 3 years mourning a father who was actually alive but unable to contact them. Emma, 17 and wise beyond her years, simply said, "I always knew he wouldn't leave us without a reason." The flight from Denver was delayed by 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, to a family that had been separated by government conspiracy and forced silence. When passengers finally began emerging from the jet bridge, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she was afraid she might collapse. She scanned every face, looking for the man she had fallen in love with 22 years earlier, the father who had missed 3 years of his children's lives, the FBI agent who had risked everything to expose corruption within his own government. When William finally appeared, Sarah almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner than she remembered, his dark hair now streaked with gray, and his eyes held a weariness that spoke of 3 years spent looking over his shoulder and sleeping with one eye open. But when he saw his family waiting for him, the transformation was immediate. The cautious, hunted expression disappeared, replaced by the warm smile that had won Sarah's heart in college, and the gentle eyes that had watched his children take their first steps, lose their first teeth, and struggle through their teenage years without him. The reunion was both everything Sarah had dreamed of and nothing like she had expected. William's embrace felt familiar but foreign, his body harder and more angular than she remembered, his hands bearing scars that told stories of 3 years she knew nothing about. Michael, now taller than his father, struggled with how to greet a man who was both a stranger and the most important person in his life. Emma simply threw herself into William's arms and whispered, "I knew you'd come back. I always knew." The drive home was filled with the kind of careful conversation that occurs between people who love each other, but don't quite know how to bridge the gap that time and trauma have created. William asked about Emma's senior year, Michael's studies at ASU, Sarah's work at the veterinary clinic she had returned to after exhausting their savings on private investigators. They talked about ordinary things, school, work, friends, as if the past 3 years had been a normal separation, rather than a nightmare of assumed death and government conspiracy. But underlying every word was the weight of what they had all endured. William carried the guilt of a father who had missed his children's high school graduations, their first heartbreaks, and countless ordinary moments that make up a family's life. Sarah struggled with the complex emotions of a woman who had grieved, raged, and slowly begun to rebuild her identity as a widow, only to discover that she was still a wife. Michael and Emma faced the challenge of reconnecting with a father who was both exactly the same and completely different from the man who had kissed them goodbye 3 years earlier. As they pulled into the driveway of the house William had built with his own hands 15 years earlier, he sat quietly for a moment, staring at the home he had dreamed of returning to for over 1,000 days. The rose bushes Sarah had planted after his disappearance were blooming, the tree where he had hung a tire swing for the children had grown taller, and the garage light he had always meant to fix was still flickering in the same irregular pattern. It was home, but it was also different, marked by 3 years of life that had continued without him. That night, as Sarah and William lay in bed together for the first time since October 15th, 2021, they talked until dawn about the road ahead. William would testify before Congress about Operation Silent Thunder and the systematic murder of federal agents. There would be trials, appeals, and years of legal proceedings as the government attempted to prosecute the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. The Hayes family would never be completely safe. Too many powerful people had too much to lose if the full truth ever emerged. But they were together again, and that was enough to start rebuilding. William would leave the FBI. He could never trust the institution that had tried to kill him, and the family would probably have to relocate for their safety. Michael was considering changing his major from criminal justice to journalism, inspired by Marcus Rodriguez's courage in exposing the truth. Emma had decided to study law, determined to become the kind of advocate who could protect families like hers from government overreach. As the sun rose over Phoenix, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Sarah of hope itself, William held his wife close and whispered the words he had wanted to say for 3 years. "I'm sorry I couldn't come home sooner. I'm sorry for the pain you all endured, but I want you to know that every day I was gone, every moment I spent gathering evidence and building a case, I was fighting to come back to you. This family is worth any sacrifice, any risk, any price I had to pay." 6 months later, the trials began. Operation Silent Thunder was exposed in all its horrific detail, resulting in the conviction of 12 government officials and the dissolution of Blackwater Dynamics. Dr. Morrison's Underground Railroad was officially disbanded, but not before receiving a presidential pardon for their years of protecting targeted federal agents. The Hayes family relocated to a small town in Montana, where William opened a private security consulting firm, and Sarah established a practice treating ranch animals. The official records still list FBI Special Agent William Hayes as having died in the line of duty on October 15, 2021. The government found it easier to maintain that fiction than to admit that they had tried to murder one of their own agents. But the Hayes family knows the truth, and that truth has made them stronger than they ever imagined possible. They learned that love can survive any separation, that families can endure any trauma, and that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is fighting against the very government you swore to serve. On quiet evenings in Montana, when the mountains turned purple in the setting sun, and the wind carries the scent of pine and possibility, William Hayes sits on his porch with his wife and children and remembers the 3 years he spent as a ghost. He thinks about the 42 other agents who remain in hiding, the families still torn apart by government conspiracy, and the price of speaking truth to power. But mostly, he thinks about how fortunate he is to be home, surrounded by the people who never stopped believing that love is stronger than lies, that truth is more powerful than conspiracy, and that some bonds cannot be broken by distance, time, or even death itself. The desert wind still whispers secrets in Phoenix, but the Hayes family no longer lives there to hear them. They have found peace in the mountains, where the only secrets are the ones nature keeps, and where the truth is as clear and enduring as the stars that shine down on their new beginning. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cold cases and disturbing mysteries across America. Thank you for following William Hayes' story. See you in the next video. In the end, the strongest chains are not those that bind us to lies, but those that connect us to the people we love.